Hello everyone, welcome back to Phenomenology. This is Mark Thorsby, and in this video we'll be taking a look at Emmanuel Levinas's essay on exteriority, totality, and infinity. So welcome back everyone. In the last two videos we introduced Emmanuel Levinas, and we took a look at the beginning part of his work on the question of the other. And you'll notice in those last two videos I tried a different style, which I think actually failed miserably. So for those of you who've been watching, and for all my students, my apologies. I think I've gone back to sort of our original format, which I think will actually bode well and help clarify a lot of what Levinas is doing. So let's jump right into it. Today we're going to be taking a look at the final three sections. Let's see if I get in there. The final three sections of the first part of Totality and Infinity. We're going to be looking at section B, separation and discourse, and we'll look at section C and then D later in the video. So that's what we're going to start off with here. There's a lot to go into in depth, and again, I just want to reiterate that unfortunately, because of just the constraints of time, I'm not going to be covering every argument that Levinas makes, since he makes quite a few. And he also tends to have a lot of discussion about specific ancient philosophers, in the relationship of ancient philosophy to phenomenology in particular. And so he's having a dialogue about the history of philosophy along with his own discussion about totality and infinity. And so in some cases, I'll mention those elements from the history of philosophy. But for the most part, we're going to be just sort of trying to stick to Levinas's positive thesis that at the end of the day, infinity is opposed to totality, and that infinity ushers in an ethical framework, and that ethics is first philosophy. So that's sort of what we're taking a look at. Now, in this section B, we're going to be looking at separation and discourse, and there we're going to be really, Levinas is looking at the question of when I'm faced with another person, there's an asymmetry that develops between us because of their alterity, because of the fact that I can never understand the other in their full presence as they themselves understand themselves, right? I can never capture the other into the same, into the I, or think about this, the I can never capture the other. So there's always preservation of alterity, of otherness within Levinas's framework. And so we're going to see that this section focuses on is the question of, okay, well, we have this separation. Well, given that separation, what does this mean about discourse in general, and language, and speech? And so we're going to see that Levinas is going to say that this ultimately funnels us into an ethical relation. So we're going to be taking a look at that in a little bit more specificity today. The first sort of section, the first paragraph, if you will, it's not technically a paragraph, but the first section is called Atheism or the Will. And we're going to see some very interesting things here. Levinas is going to argue that at the fundamental level, we have an atheistic form of relationship to the other. And that this atheism presupposes, actually, any sort of theology. It presupposes any relationship one has with the divine or God. And so we're going to see here that the discussion that Levinas is having here clearly has a sort of resonance with his other theological writings. But more importantly, he thinks that that atheism is, if you will, a designation for describing the structural ethical relationship that one has with the other, that one has with regard to the totality of the same and the infinity of the other. And so atheism is sort of an interesting concept here he's going to be talking about. And for those of you who've been taking philosophy for a long time, you've probably become accustomed to modern philosophers really not thinking in too much depth about atheism and belief and theology in a really sort of rigorous metaphysical sense. But we're going to see that today with Levinas, at least to a certain degree. I will also say that in preparing this and in reading Levinas's work, of course, it is notable how much of a religious thinker he actually is at the end of the day. And so, although I know that his Talmudic interpretations and commentaries were published under a separate publisher, and he really tries to keep his theological writings separate from his philosophical writings, I think at this point we see a strong interconnection and intersection between the two. And we won't be going into those, but this might be a nice avenue of research for you in your own writing and in your own thinking. Okay, well, let's jump into it. So we're talking about atheism or the will, right? And that's interesting. We'll see that when you read Levinas, he doesn't use the term will too much, but atheism refers to this, but he's going to refer to the atheism of the subject as a sort of form of will. Now, we're ultimately talking about the separation of the other and the same, right? And here I've sort of tried to designate, there's a relationship between the I and the other. I made the other bigger just so you can sort of demonstrably see an illustration between the asymmetry between the two, right? The other stands as infinite compared to the sameness of the totality of the I. And so we have this. And now, Levinas starts off by saying, but we have to be clear that this is not an antithetical relationship. We're not talking about thesis and antithesis here, right? We're not saying that their I is one thing and the other is just the non-I, right? Just the privation of the I. This is not his idea here, right? He ultimately wants to argue that for a non-integratable transcendence, such that when I talk about a thesis and an antithesis, I can talk about an X and a non-X, as it were, or the non-X. And he says, well, you can see here that in a thesis-antithesis relationship, the definition of the thesis and the antithesis, the I and the other, if you will, are always linked together in a sort of equality or symmetry with each other. And this is not the case. And so, because he wants to argue that the other is transcendent to the same. And this transcendence can't be integrated into the totality of the I, right? So when I meet a person on the street, I have my experience, but I recognize the face of the other. That face is an infinite otherness exterior to my own. And this sort of transcendence can't just be integrated or pulled in or rarefied into the sameness of my perceptions. The other always remains absolutely other, despite the fact that I can recognize them, speak with them, and actually be involved with them. Their otherness has to be preserved. That's his priority of investigation. Now, what can we say about the I-other relationship? Well, we can say that it's a positive movement, right? It's something that's positively happening. So it's not just a movement of negation. It's not a I, non-I. It's something positive. The other imposes itself or herself in a concrete moral experience. So we have a concrete moral experience of the other. And he says it's commonplace, such that it's everywhere. It's really what he's describing here is really the glue that binds together society. And it's this concrete moral experience that ultimately is grounded in a metaphysical relationship between the totality of the same and the infinity of the other. And this is the asymmetrical element to the non-integratable transcendence. So my apologies, I know the language can be sort of tedious, and I appreciate your patience here as we go through this. Okay, so that's the first sort of thing he mentions here. Now, when we talk about separation, where's this separation occurring? Well, the separation is inner, right? And think here about the notion that I recognize that I'm not you because I have an inner experience, right? So we're talking about psychism here, right? The idea we're talking about the psychology of the mind. So this is an important element. And he says that this psychism is an event in being, but it's also a way of being, right? So the separation that I recognize first is grounded in my inner experience, and it's inner, and it's an event in being. It's about being, but it also concerns a mode of being, a way of being. And this, of course, is obviously reminiscent of Heidegger's ontological distinction. So take a look at that, and you can see here that now we should be careful here because Levinas is not doing ontology, so he's not making the same point, and he's not prioritizing the ontological distinction in the same way here. But you can see here that he is sort of generating that discussion. Now, one of the things that's interesting is when we talk about this separation, this inner separation, if you will. Obviously, we can say that the other exists, and then the effect of the other is that I recognize their otherness. But he says that in our experience of the other, we have a logical, chronological inversion where the effect seems to come before the cause. That is, the effect of the other, which is an effect of transcendence, they transcend my totality. That effect, I recognize that before I can actually get to the other. So in a certain way, the cause of this transcendence that I'm experiencing in this concrete moral experience is something that's sort of inverted. I experience it out of order from its logical structure. Um, right? And that's because I can never grasp the other, right? This is what it means to maintain rigorously the importance of the separation between the same and the other, between totality and infinity here, right? Now, Levinas adds on 54, separation is not reflected in thought, but it's produced by it. For in it, the after or the effect conditions the before or the cause. The before appears and is only welcomed, right? Now, by the way, these are my caps. Levinas doesn't have these, although he does, I believe, have the appears in italics. But I wanted to emphasize here this chronological inversion that Levinas seems to be describing and articulating. Now, when we talk about what is this thought of separation, we should think immediately about the cogito of Descartes, the I of the I think, right? Remember here, for those of you who need a brief sort of reminder, René Descartes founds and begins and reorients modern philosophy according to the I think, therefore I am. The most certain thing we have is our knowledge of our own subjective existence. Now, that doesn't mean we actually know much about our subjective existence, namely just that we know of our subjective existence. Now, this is the cogito, right? Now, cogito is the, if you will, the line that separates myself and the other. It is the thought of separation. Remember, we're talking about the inner here, right? The cogito seems present to itself as an integrated whole, right? That doesn't mean it necessarily is, but it appears that way. Now, ignorance is a detachment comparable to self-ignorance in which things lie. It is founded in the interiority of a psychism. It is positive in the enjoyment of itself. The imprisoned being, ignorant of its prison, is at home with itself. Its power for illusion constitutes its separation. So you can see here, Levinas is describing the mode of separation between the cogito, the I, and the other here. And it's related to enjoyment. We're going to see that's going to play an important element here coming forward, especially when we start talking about desire. Now, it also is worth remarking that there's a whole section of Totality and Infinity about the enjoyment of the same that we haven't really talked about. We've actually skipped over, and I want you need to take a look at that for a full, comprehensive understanding of Levinas's work. Now, let's go back to the cogito, right? The life permits the cogito to live as an as for me, right? Don't you love philosophers when they sort of create their own words with hyphens, or at least translators do of the German philosophers? Not German, I'm sorry, French, my apologies. Right. Life permits the cogito to live as an as for me. So the centrality of the cogito, of the I think, is demonstrated in life. And as we live for ourselves, right? And so that means that as we live for ourselves, we're ultimately living egocentrically. And the as for me really refers to an absence in the face of the other. And totalization gets accomplished in its history. Now, Levinas has a very fascinating discussion in these pages when he talks about history, universal time, and interiority. And ultimately, one of the things he's suggesting here is that history actually becomes a means by which we can conflate the other into the same, by which totality gets the best of the infinity of the other, if you will. Because when I understand someone according to a history, what happens is they turn into an object that can be seen from a perspective that's not in a relationship of asymmetry, but one which treats the I and the other as ultimately the same, as elements within the historical theme or the historical narrative. And this means that history proceeds according to a conception of universal time, no beginning and ending, as it were, the same for all. But consequently, right, what this means is this becomes a way in which the same, the interiority of the cogito, of the I, can thematize the other and thereby reduce the other away from their exteriority. Now, this becomes sort of interesting when you think about history, and of course, because of Levinas's history, his own personal biographical life in terms of his surviving the Nazis. I was thinking about the Nazis here. And also Hannah Arendt talks about this, the way in which the Nazis, the National Socialists, created an ideology of a historical narrative where individuals got sacrificed to the historical trajectory of the Aryan race from the perspective of the German National Socialists in the Second World War and before, right? So for the Nazis, history became a way to thematize the other, both the other in terms of the Jew and also the other in terms of the people who lived, the other Germans too. And history became a grand arching narrative that conflated and reduced the other into some sort of momentary element within a universal theme of history. And by doing so, of course, it's clear the sorts of moral ramifications that occurred or followed through, right? It's clear that we had not only genocide, but one of the greatest tragedies and war crimes of human history occurs. And it occurs under the auspices of a historical mentality that's able to dispense with the other. So I want you to see here why I mentioned in the previous video the strong resonance between Levinas's history in his victimization, I think, as a Jewish man, and his ethics here, and the way in which he wants to emphasize that ethics requires and begins with the infinite exteriority of the other. So you have a lot of themes being pronounced here when we talk about this difference between exteriority and interiority, the I and the other. Now, when we talk about separation and interiority, well, separation, what does that talk about? Well, separation designates the possibility of an existent being set up and having its own destiny to itself, right? So separation sort of gets us this idea that when I recognize I'm separate, I recognize that I have my own destiny that I'm following, etc., right? This is, again, a sort of movement and a description, ultimately, of egoism. Now, interiority, not just the fact that you're separate from the other, but the emphasis of the interiority, the inner life of the self, the inner life of the same, as Levinas would put it, really refers to the very possibility of a birth and a death that do not derive their meaning from history. Interiority institutes an order different from historical time, in which totality is constituted, an order where everything is pending, where what is no longer possible historically remains always possible. So here we see Levinas giving a phenomenological description of what it means to be interior, right? My inner life is something that the meaning of my inner life and my inner experience is not something that I derive from history, right? It's something that's very different. And also consider the way in which, as I live my life, even though I've made choices, I can still imagine myself making different choices along a different historical arc or narrative. And that means that my inner life is one in which I recognize myself as something that's constantly pending. It's on its way, but is not yet complete, right? Whereas the problem is the historical is something that always sees its object as complete, as a fact. And that means that there's a difference here between the historicity that maybe flows out of my recognition of the separation of the other from the historicity that is not present in the interiority of my inner life, as it were, right? Remember, we're talking about the same ultimately here, or the self, the I, right? Now, you see here there's a sort of paradox at play here, and this paradox, Levinas argues, is overcome by this psychism. Okay, now how can this be overcome? Well, the answer here is memory, right? Now, in memory is the means by which I'm able to also understand myself and project myself in different ways, right? We have this idea that in the totality of the historiographer, the death of the other is an end. Interiority is the refusal to be transformed into pure loss, figuring in an alien encountering system. Let me also read you this sort of quote. Let me pull it up larger. Levinas writes, "Memory recaptures and reverses and suspends what is already accomplished in birth, in nature. Fecundity escapes the punctual instant of death. By memory, I ground myself after the event retroactively. I assume today what in the absolute past of the origin had no subject to receive it, and it had therefore the weight of a fatality. By memory, I assume and put back into question. Memory realizes the impossible. Memory, after the event, assumes the passivity of the event and it masters it. Memory, as an inversion of historical time, is the essence of interiority." So you could say when we talk about historical time, the inverse of it is memory. And memory is the psychic element that allows us ultimately to contrast ourselves with the historical, right? Now, in the totality of the historiographer, the death of the other is an end. But that's not the case from the interiority. Now, there's this interesting discussion where Levinas mentions death agony. And he gives that sort of a phenomenology of what does it mean to be a person who's in the midst of dying and feels the agony of death. And here, Levinas isn't talking about agony in terms of the pain of death, but the agony of the being whom is dying. That is, agony in terms of the realization and the encountering of the fact that one will no longer exist. I mean, you're watching this video right now. You too will die. And what does that mean? At some point, if you're lucky, right, you'll have death agony in an existential sense, where you can sort of recognize that you can, on the one hand, recognize that there is existence beyond this, beyond you, and yet you recognize that that existence is not for you, right? And you're sort of in an in-between place, as it were, right? Levinas adds, "The death agony is precisely in this impossibility of ceasing, in the ambiguity of a time that has run out of a mysterious time and yet remains. Death is consequently not reducible to the end of a being. What still remains is totally different from the future of what one welcomes, that one projects forth and in a certain measure draws from oneself. For a being to whom everything happens in conformity and projects, death is an absolute event, absolutely a posteriori, open to no power, not even to negation. Dying is agony because in dying, a being does not come to an end while coming to an end," right? Think about it. One doesn't, you'll never know that you're dead, right? Which means that to know that you're dying is to know something that you can't know, as it were, right? And so it's very sort of fascinating discussion here in his analysis of the psychism and using death agony and our potential experience of death as really a launching point for thinking about separation and exteriority, and as well as interiority, right? Now, there's two sorts of conceptions of time you can see that Levinas has been discussing. On the one hand, we might call the first conception of time an objective time, historical time. This is where the I gets reduced to a third person, right? That's where it's no longer my story, but I'm just a third personal character in the story, right? This is the objective historical time, which, by the way, we don't experience ourselves as such, right? We can think of ourselves in this way, but our average everyday experience is one not of objective time, but rather maybe of subjective time or interior time. Now, he says interior time is a sort of secrecy in the sense that no one else except you has that experience of this interior time. Now, he thinks that this interiorization of each of the subjects within a society is what enables plurality, social plurality. We do a lot of discussion between, especially in modern day academy, between difference, diversity, and things like this, right? The diversity of persons, the diversity of identity. We talked about gender identity, for instance, in this class. What is this plurality based in? Well, this plurality is based in the inner experience that we have. It's based upon this interiority of the same, the psychism related to memory and so forth, right? He writes, quote, "The interval of discretion or of death is a third notion between being and nothingness. Now, for those of you who've watched, or I'm sorry, not watched, but read Jean-Paul Sartre's Being and Nothingness, you can see clearly that Levinas is making a sort of side remark in relation to Sartre. Okay, well, how are we to functionally understand this discussion? Well, the inner life is unique. Rather, the inner life is the unique way for the real to exist as a plurality, not as a totality, right? Right, remember, Levinas's ethics enables us to maintain the otherness of the other. That is, so I think we gave the example of black culture in our last class, American black culture, right? You can see here that the plurality the plurality of our experiences is related to our inner life, where we don't treat the other as a totality, right? The inner life is a separation, and this separation is best understood in terms of atheism. And atheism here, of course, is a way of thinking about the egoism of the I, right? So I have this inner time sort of consciousness, I have memory, and I have this psychism, sort of constituted psychological or psychic structure that enables me to understand the world, but also to understand myself as contraposed and distinct from the world. Now, for him, ultimately, because my experience as a self is always organized by my relationship to the other is thought of as infinite, that means that the self, as inner, takes on this atheistic sense. Let's move here to the next slide. Now, atheism for Levinas is a structural description. Levinas is not describing a proposition about one's belief in God here. He's rather arguing that the ethical relationship begins in terms of the separation of the inner from the other, and that separation is one in which precedes and comes before the other, right? So to take the separation of the other seriously means that we have to recognize that in a deep sense that the same, or the I, is not in need of the other. Rather, we'll see by the end of today's video, it's the idea that the same is in desire of the other. So he makes this interesting distinction. But atheism is a structural description. And by saying that, what we mean is atheism is prior to any understanding, position, or belief in the divine. So we're not talking here about, we're talking about atheism as an existential constitutional description, not atheism as a statement of belief here. So that's very different, and you should keep clear on that. Of course, let's see what else he says. By atheism, we thus understand a position prior to both the negation and the affirmation of the divine, the breaking with participation by which the I posits itself as the same and as the I. So atheism here is a sort of a metaphysical, well, I guess you might say it's an ontological characterization, right? Now, the atheism of the same is not causa sui. It doesn't create itself. And this atheism allows for every individual to have their own independent viewpoint. And this is what we mean by the will, right? This independent perspective, this egoistic sourcing of the I, the totality of the same, right? This is ultimately what the will is related to for Levinas. And think here, or a way of describing this is, when we talk about this psychism, we have a certain psychological constitution, we have a sensibility of the world, and that sensibility gets organized in terms of our enjoyment of the world. So if we ignore the other completely, the infinity of the other and all that stuff, and just talk about the I and the same, we see here the Levinas articulating a form of egoism in which the I understands the sensibility of the world in terms of what pleases the I, or how we enjoy the world. So this is sort of an egoism. Now, the separation of the same and the other is not adequately described by any monadology. And here Levinas is thinking, obviously, of Leibniz, who articulates monadology in its first iteration, but also Edmund Husserl, which, unfortunately, in our video lectures, we didn't get to this. We did talk a little bit about it, but Husserl ultimately articulates what he calls an intersubjective monadology, where every individual is an ego, and the egos are related to each other, but they're always treated as something which is objectively neutral, right? We'll see that the ultimately Husserl and Leibniz, by employing a monadology to describe the experience of the same and the other, ultimately take a route that's very similar to the thematization of the other and the same that we see in, for instance, the historiography. Right? And here, basically, what we're talking about is the interiority and the singularization of sensation, that I'm the only one who senses this, so this is part of me, and so on and so forth. So we have first here in this first paragraph, Levinas' distinction of what separation means, and that is, of course, what does it mean to talk about ourselves, right, as opposed to talking about the other. Now, point 2 is truth. Truth becomes an important part. Levinas says, the separation is produced primordially in the enjoyment of happiness and is not derived from the other. So the separation we have from the other comes from our egoistic enjoyment in the world. It doesn't come from the other as such, or it's not typically derived in that sense, right? He says it's accomplished in all the plenitude of economic existence. And when Levinas talks about economic existence, he's talking about the way in which we can exchange things for other things. But remember, a system of exchange always maintains the I as dominant, right? And so he's not going to argue that the ethics that gets created out of the other is an ethics of exchange. It's not an economy as such. Now, but how is all of this accomplished? Ultimately, truth. And so, very fascinating set of readings here with Levinas, where Levinas argues that truth is the modality, it's the mode of the relation between the same and the other. So truth becomes a very important criteria for understanding how this separation actually occurs, right? The atheist separation is required by an idea of infinity, but it's not dialectically brought about by it, right? So dialectically, this notion of separation doesn't come about in a dialectical sense. But it is structurally required. Now, let's think about this. If there's no separation, there's no truth, only being, right? Think about it this way. In order for me to know that something's true, right, then I have to recognize that I myself am not that which is true. So if you don't have a separation, if there is no relationship between that which thinks and that which is true, if there's not a separation between those, then all you're talking about is being, just existing. And that's not truth, right? Truth for Levinas is a function ultimately related to the interior/exterior relation, right? Truth can undo the distance between the known and the knower, but it's not a totality, right? So his idea here isn't that when I gain truth, it's not that I've turned what is known into the knower, right? And it's precisely because the knower and the known are separate that truth actually makes any sense. He has this passage: the quest for truth unfolds in the apparition of forms. Now, the distinctive characteristic of forms is precisely their epiphany at a distance. Now, remember, when we talk about forms, that means I recognize things that, when I'm searching for truth, I'm recognizing truth in terms of apparitions and these arrivals of different forms, right? Now, that doesn't mean that the form is the truth, but it's a necessary structural element to it. Now, not suddenly, but Levinas begins to then talk about interiority, and actually the myth of Gyges. I sort of put here a little picture from Lord of the Rings I found online. But Lord of the Rings, right, is about a person who is about the ring, you put it on, it makes you invisible and all this, and you can do whatever you want. Of course, it comes from the myth of Gyges, which Plato recounts, in which Gyges finds this invisible ring on a dead skeleton, steals it, figures out you become invisible, and then he takes over the kingdom, right? And the myth of Gyges in Plato is a way of discussing, and it raises a problem for Plato, ultimately of, well, wait a second, don't we only do what's just because it's in our interest? And if no one's looking, then we're gonna put on if we had our invisible ring, we would do whatever we wanted according to our own egoism. So you can see here that along with his long sort of commentary on the history of philosophy, Levinas is bringing in here the ethical conceptions and problematics that come along with interiority and the sort of atheistic egoism that he's been describing, right? The myth of Gyges is the very myth of the eye and ear interiority, which exist non-recognized. Now, here's two more quotes for you. Levinas says, truth presupposes a being autonomous in separation. So, truth presupposes that I have an existence that's autonomous in this separation, right? And the quest for truth is precisely a relation that does not rest on the privation of need, right? We're going to see it ultimately rest on desire, right? He says, but the quest for truth is an event more fundamental than theory, because theoretical research is actually a privileged mode of the relation with exteriority that we call truth, right? So there's sort of interesting questions that are getting involved here with Levinas about the relationship, the phenomenological uncoverings of what truth consists in, right? Now, separation and interiority, truth and language, constitute the categories of the idea of infinity or metaphysics. So these concepts that we've talked about, separation, interiority, truth, and language, these are fundamental to Levinas's whole sort of framework. Infinity is revealed in the other. And ultimately, when we talk about infinity, remember, atheism is the a priori structural position for the same, for the I, as opposed to the other. Infinity gets revealed by the other. So what that means is there's no natural religion here, right? There's no God that gets revealed. And for the most part, I'm not going to talk too much about his discussion of God, though. That could be its own video, I think. Infinity is not an object of cognition, though. It's what arouses desire, right? And ultimately, that's what he's going to argue. He's going to argue that the truth is ultimately rooted not in a privation of need, but in an arousal of desire. Now, desire is what measures the infinite, right? Desire is how we recognize the overflowing nature of the other's infinity, right? Truth is sought in the other, but by him who lacks nothing. Truth arises in the other when one is spoken to by the other, because it's by language that the other commands the same. It's by language that the other announces their infinity, and that's by the means by which I recognize the exterior and asymmetrical heterogeneity that the other has over me. So language here is ultimately the key that Levinas is moving towards, right? He says the I exists has separated its enjoyment, and that's what it means for it to be happy. And it finds itself above or at the apex, at the apogee of being by enjoying it by happiness and by desiring truth and justice. So you can see he has a very, very different sort of general understanding. I'm sorry, pardon me. Hold on, let me pause that. Sorry about that. Right. So remember, he's beginning with this sort of egoology here, and it's a very different phenomenological train, right? I think than many might expect. Now, he wants to say that when he's talking about desire, it's not the same thing as platonic love. And I don't want to go into that, but take a look at Plato's Sophist in terms of understanding what Plato means by love, right? Immortality is not the object of the first movement of desire, but the other, the stranger. That is, immortality is the object of the other, right? Of that which is exterior, right? And Plato goes, because remember, Plato has a discussion here about the love of the forms related to the immortality of the soul, and so Levinas is making a comment about that, right? But I do want to draw your attention to three quotes that come from this passage. He says, finally, the distance that separates happiness from desire separates politics from religion. Politics tends towards reciprocal recognition, that is towards equality, right? It ensures happiness, right? Religion is desire and not a struggle for recognition. It is the surplus possible in a society of equals, that of glorious humility, responsibility, and sacrifice, which are the condition for equality itself. So you can see here, metaphysics for him ultimately is related to politics. And in fact, you might say that politics presumes this ethical relationship, right? And politics is Well, I'm not going to go into Levinas's entire discussion of politics, but there's an interesting relation there that I want you to be thinking about as you read this text. Now, number 3, discourse. The question is, okay, so now we've got this conception of truth. Well, we're at separation and truth. Well, how does truth announce itself? And the answer for Levinas is going to be discourse. And discourse is going to simultaneously be the way in which we begin to recognize um, um, in which the ethics of the other announces itself, to put it that way. Now, truth, when we talk about truth, truth is something that always illuminates the intellect, right? Being illuminates the intellect. And so truth is something that always requires intellection, actually, right? Separation requires autonomy of the separated being. And absolute otherness refers to the absolute otherness here refers to language allows the I and the other to absolve themselves of the relation. So what Levinas wants to do is, and I created this sort of thing, it's maybe kind of hard to see, but this sort of structural module for understanding, or structural illustration for understanding Levinas here. We have the I and we have the other, and I put the other higher so you can sort of see that there's a metaphysical transcendence. Now, ultimately, in order to maintain the separation of the I and the other, we have to take that seriously, which means that the I and the other always remain separate, fundamentally, but there clearly is a relationship. That relationship occurs through language. Language plays, if you will, the third term that allows the other to be recognized, right? So separation requires the autonomy. We have to maintain the absolute otherness of each of the other. Language is this middle relation which allows us ultimately to understand and recognize the other and yet still maintain their otherness. Now, some of you, in Levinas talks to us, some of people may think that knowledge is enough. That is, why can't we just say that I have knowledge of the other and that's good enough? What's the problem with that? Well, and that is, can't knowledge of the other be sufficient? Here, think about someone like Husserl, who really just argues that the other is understood really as a type of eidetic knowledge. So if you go back to the ideas 1 and ideas 2, that's Husserl's basic sort of understanding, is that there's certain intentional correlates in consciousness which enable the other to be known, right? But it's always under an auspices of knowledge. And this is what Levinas disagrees with, right? He says, now, there is an advantage to this, and that's the disinterestedness, right? So if our knowledge, if the other is just known in a relationship of knowledge, then the nice part is that would maintain a sort of disinterestedness. But there's a big problem here, and I've tried to sort of synoptically represent it here. Number one is the way in which we approach being is always relevant to the question of being itself, right? So the way in which we think about being is itself relevant to what we end up knowing about being, right? That's because inquiry is itself a mode of being, right? And he mentions Phaedrus here from Plato, where in the Phaedrus, Levinas pulls out this idea that a disclosed being is always relevant to us. So a being that's disclosed, and remember, the relationship that I have with the other is not a relationship of disclosure, right? That's what Heidegger thinks. That's not what Levinas thinks. Levinas thinks that the relationship I have with an other in terms of knowledge, the relationship between the known and the knower is a relationship of disclosure, right? But this is not a kathe auto, which can be translated as exactly as oneself, right? Exactly as it is in itself, something like that, right? The kathe auto. And the idea here is that knowledge doesn't reveal what something is in itself, because to do so is to misunderstand. Because remember, we have a sensation, and then from sensation we gain understanding, and then we gain knowledge, right? So, but here's the thing is, everyone has different sensation, right? So, and my inner experience, my inner sensation, my sensation, which is sort of correlated in my inner experience, this is something that can never be known, right? Only I can know it, as it were. So, and we have to also remember that knowledge is a project-oriented mode of being, right? He says on 64, we disclose being with respect to a project. So 5, in order to satisfy our criterion, knowledge would require us to have a pure experience of the other, the way the other experiences at itself, way the other experiences itself, right? Therefore, the absolute otherness of the relation, if conceived as knowledge, is not a relation in which the other can absolve the relation. Now, what do we mean by here, right? What he wants to say is that to maintain the absolute exteriority between the I and the other, the self and the same and the other, that means that at any point, that relation should be possible for any one of these participants to absolve themselves of the relationship, to pull back into themselves, as it were, not to constantly be totalized into each other, which means that it can't be a mode of knowledge here, because knowledge is about a disclosure of being. And if you have a disclosure of being, then, which is a project of being, right? Knowledge is a project of being. If you have it, if it's manifest or organized in terms of disclosure, then what you have is you have a relation in which the other cannot absolve itself of you, or vice versa. So that means that knowledge is an insufficient criterion when we look at discourse here, right? Or we're going to see knowledge. So when we talk about discourse, we're not talking about just gathering knowledge, right? What does Levinas say? He says, well, if the object thus refers to the project and labor of the known, it is because objective knowledge, objective cognition is a relation with being that one always goes beyond and that always is to be interpreted. The what it is approaches this qua that. For to know objectively is to know the historical, the fact, the already happened, the already passed by, right? So what happens here is when we talk about knowledge, knowledge thematizes the other. That is objective knowledge. Objective knowledge thematizes the other into something that can be known in its totality, right? And that means that the other no longer speaks. And if the other can no longer speak, then the other cannot be absolved of the relation. And the other is no longer, we no longer treat or recognize the otherness of the other as philosophically important, right? So let's go through this quickly. The form of being we take on in objective, we have a form of being that we take on in objective knowledge, and it's one in which time is suspended into the historical, right? The world loses its principle. That is, the world of a shared world in which I'm actively living in the world, it loses its principle, right? Because when you thematize historically, the principle of you, even as an egoistic being that's trying to have desire and have happiness, right? None of that matters historically, right? And that means that the world becomes anarchical. It becomes a type of anarchy, right? And that means that truth, fortuitously, can no longer function as an organizing principle. And so instead, enjoyment organizes the knowledge of the other. Now, the absolute experience is not disclosure, but revelation. So by contrast, the absolute experience I have of the otherness, where their alterity is preserved, is one that needs to be described in terms of revelation, right? He says, the manifestation of the kathe auto, in which a being concerns us without slipping away and without betraying itself, does not consist in its being disclosed, right? Manifestation kathe auto consists in a being telling itself to us independently of every position we would have taken in regard. That is, expressing itself. So the absolute experience I have of the other is the revelation that it incurs when the other expresses itself, because only the other can express themselves, right? So that means that we can distinguish this. Levinas has been making this distinction between the face and form, where the face ultimately for Levinas stands above form, right? Form is one in which alienates the exteriority of the other. So for instance, if I see someone and I recognize them as belonging to a certain class or group, or maybe I recognize them as being a form of a certain historical narrative, right? Think about the way the Nazis treated the Jews, understanding them according to their own historical narrative. That means that the exteriority of the other got completely alienated and reduced out of the equation. So the face, what is the face by contrast? The face is a living presence. It is a presence which expresses itself, and that expression is one which resists a totality of thematization, right? The face expresses itself, it's a living presence, and it resists this objective thematization. Now, for Levinas, the face is the first entry point of expression, but language becomes the sort of really critical structural element that allows me to actually be able to communicate with the other. But I wanted to show you this picture, which I just love. This comes from the video Baraka, in which you see the face of a monkey. And a monkey is a being which is totally alien to human experience, but yet you can see in this video that the other expresses itself with the face. And so I wanted to show you this brief video here just to give you a sense of what it looks like. Take a look, take a watch. Hold on, let me maybe fast forward here. Sorry. Also, I believe this was filmed in the Himalayas. There we go. Then we'll pause it there. By the way, take a look at that video, that movie. It's called Baraka, and it's about man's relationship, humanity's relationship with the infinite. So it's very pointed and well placed for our video. But I love that video, that short clip of the monkey here, because what you see there is you see the recognition of a face, and the face as being an other. Totally exterior. So I wanted to sort of do this. Now, ultimately, for Levinas, he's not concerned with monkeys. He's concerned with people. And for him, ultimately, the face is fully revealed through language and through meaning and signification. Right? Because when we talk about language, we're talking about to signify. We use terms that actually have no meaning on their own. They just refer to things that do have meaning, right? The actual word philosophy, the actual utterance, the like the sounds themselves have no meaning. They're merely representative. That is, they're signifiers for something that's signified. So the question here is, what does it mean to signify? Well, to signify is not to give, number one, right? To signify, it's not an ideal essence. So when I hear a signification, the signification is not an ideal essence. It's not a form in this Platonic sense. It's not an event that's irreducible to evidence either. The face is irreducible to evidence, but the signifier is not, right? And also, the signifier does not enter into intuition, right? It signifies a presence of something else. And so what this seems to indicate here is that in language, we have a possibility of as it were pointing back to the exterior infinity of the other without totalizing it or thematizing it into the same. Now, when we talk about language, you might say, well, isn't language a type of action? Well, Lebanon says action does not express. So just to do something is not the same thing as an expression. So there's a logical philosophical distinction at play here. The distinction between acting and expressing. Now, language certainly is a type of action in terms of there's gestures of behavior, but this, for Levinas, quote, omits the essential of language, right? That is the coinciding of the revealer and the revealed in the face, which is accomplished in being, in height, with respect to us, in teaching. So language allows the relation between the I and the other to reveal its katheauto without having to be thematized. Now, there is a critique of Husserl and Heidegger here that Levinas is interested in expressing. Right? For Husserl, my recognition of the other was based upon my recognizing their body and then pairing that their body was similar to mine, right? And that the other had an ego like mine. And so intersubjectivity for Husserl is this monadology where I recognize others as formally like mine and I sort of synchronize my own activities to their activities, right? This is not what the sort of function of language that Husserl has, that Levinas has in mind. For Heidegger, my relationship with the other is one of coexistence, right? But the relationship ultimately rests upon being in general. This is what the Heidegger's investment of the ontological distinction amounts to. The idea that being as such stands before beings, right? The individual entities that exist. And which that means is that the coexistence conception that Heidegger employs is one which creates a neutral intersubjectivity, one in which the other's exteriority is not maintained. And so language for Levinas is a way in which the face-to-face can announce itself, the way in which the face can announce and express itself. Now, this means that the speech, the language we have in discourse, has a magisterial function, right? Language is the way in which the majesty of the other, the infinity of the other, can reveal itself without totalizing itself, right? The object is presented when we have welcomed an interlocutor, right? Language does not condition consciousness. These are sort of important elements or footnotes in Levinas's conception. Now, number 4 here is rhetoric and injustice. Ultimately, rhetoric, right, and here he's thinking about truth and sophism. Sophistry, rhetoric is the art of trying to persuade people of that which they don't want to be persuaded of, right? So that means that, remember, rhetoric is a form of power. And this is very, very different from discourse. So discourse has a really primordial function for Levinas in which the other can preserve its exteriority. But rhetoric is a way in which the other's exteriority gets reduced into the same. And that's because it's a form of language that seeks power, not truth, right? Not every discourse is in a relationship with exteriority, the way in which we've described it, the way in which Levinas describes it. And think here about, for instance, the way in which we talk to objects. I talk to my computer when it stops working. The way in which we talk to infants, right? The way we talk about people who are in a multitude. Think about the way a presidential candidate talks to the crowd, right? These are modes of speech which do not maintain the exteriority or do not preserve the exteriority of the other, right? And this is a way in which truth gets dissolved, I think, right? Rhetoric is an anti-discursive speech, and that's my language, not Levinas's. But you can see here, Levinas says that rhetoric, right, resists discourse, right? It approaches the other not to face him, but obliquely, not to be sure as a thing, since rhetoric remains conversation, and across all of its artifices goes unto the other, solicits his yes. So the goal of rhetoric is to get the other to agree to you, right? To say yes to you. That is, to become thematized by you, right? But the specific nature of rhetoric consists in corrupting this freedom. That is the freedom of the other, right? You're trying to corrupt the freedom of the other and through a power of speech, really manipulate them into consent or assent, right? And this is, for Levinas, a form of violence in its injustice. So Levinas really falls within the long philosophical tradition of arguing against rhetoric here, right? Because rhetoric for him treats the other as a pure thematized object, right? Now, justice, by contrast, is the face-to-face approach. Justice is what we refer to as the conversation, the way in which the other and the same converse, the way in which they can come together, right? Now, and justice here is a way of, is a concept that Levinas thinks can enable us to respect the fact that the other qua other is the other, right? This is the emphasis on exteriority that Levinas makes again and again in the text, right? He says, if truth arises in the absolute experience in which being gleams with its own light, then truth is produced only in veritable conversation or in justice, right? So an emphasis here on ethics as first philosophy. The way I recognize the other is through language, which means that language, discourse, is functional towards justice, right? So you can see here that the way in which we talk to each other is very, very important. And it has huge implications ethically. Now, quickly, a couple notes here about the asymmetrical element of discourse. Remember, even though the conversations, the way in which the other and the same can come together in a conversant sense, because it maintains the alterity of each through the structure of language here, it's also important to recognize that there's an asymmetry here, right? Levinas says that the interlocutors are not equals, right? They're not equal. They're not, well, I think that's pretty clear, right? So when I'm in a conversation, we're not equals because the other has to express themselves to me, and only they can do that, which means that they become the master, right? And I guess conversely, I become their master phenomenologically, right? So truth is made possible by relation with the other, our master. Justice consists in recognizing in the other my master. Equality is an economic conception, and so justice is not, he doesn't think of justice here as an economic system of exchange. Justice is, quote, the recognition of the other's privilege qua other and their mastery, end quote, outside of rhetoric. So justice coincides with the overcoming of rhetoric. So to have justice is to overcome and to go beyond a relationship of power and language, i.e. rhetoric, which ultimately is a type of sophism. Now, here's what I'm going to do is we're now at an hour in. I'm going to stop right here. In part 2 of this video, we'll pick up on Section 5, Discourse and Ethics, and really talking about the way in which Levinas articulates ethics as first philosophy insofar as it is bound to the discursive enterprise of speaking with each other. Thank you guys very much for watching online. I apologize, my hair is kind of a mess. But thank you very much for watching. I look forward to seeing you guys online. And feel free to watch the next video when it's available. Talk to you later. Bye.